The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
This evening of a series of dialogues which began 2 years ago at the Jewish Museum under the general rubric of the limits of modernity. Then we dealt with the broad crisis facing religion and modern consciousness. Topics included living with disenchantment, modernity and its discontents, the sacred symbols of secular people, the question of authority and the religion of art. These were the problems that we solved so very successfully at the Jewish Museum. Since we solved them then, we have to take a stab at something new. And therefore, we've chosen some far more particularistic terms with which to deal. One might, in fact, call tonight's topic a bit tribal. I happen to like Indian tribes. The Radius Institute, a small nonprofit programming and policy planning center which I direct, unlike most Jewish institutions, feels strongly that controversy among Jews, provided it is civilized controversy, is a good thing. Only by examining old cliches, by continuing to subject accepted ideologies to fresh analyses, only by re-examining public policy issues and testing their current validity can we arrive at intelligent decisions for a Jewish people which it seems is perpetually in a state of crisis. Parallel to our discussions tonight, a smaller grouping called the Radius Fellowship, made up of 15 younger Jewish academicians and communal servants, is engaged in an ongoing analysis of these same issues at a series of monthly meetings which are held at the American Jewish Committee. This evening we begin a similar process, but a public one, drawing on the expertise of some of our mentors. Irving Kristol is the founding editor of a journal called The Public Interest. He also serves as professor of urban values at the Business School of New York University. In his book, The Neoconservatives, subtitled The Men Who Are Changing America, Peter Steinfels calls Irving Kristol the leading neoconservative thinker of our generation and devotes his first biographic chapter to Professor Kristol's thought. Steinfels quotes Irving Kristol at one point to the effect that conservative thought is the appropriate philosophy of a man in middle age. I must admit that I imagine I'm getting to that point since I find so much of what Professor Kristol has to say particularly stimulating. Arthur Hertzberg is an unrepentant Jewish liberal. That's my term. What that means, however, is another question. Arthur is a rabbi of great distinction, a professor at Columbia University, and a Jewish politician, or better, a Jewish statesman of the highest order. To have survived in the world of national Jewish organizational life for as long as Arthur has, and to have continued to say the kinds of blunt things which we expect from him, this is no small achievement. Our moderator tonight, John Ruskay, chairs the Radius Fellowship, along with his colleague Ira Silverman of the American Jewish Committee. John, who holds a doctorate in political science from Columbia University, is the vice president of the Reconstructionist Foundation. And in my book, he is one of the most capable of a younger generation of Jewish communal professionals. Tonight's program represents a cooperative endeavor between the Radius Institute, the National Jewish Resource Center, and the 92nd Street YMHA. I'd particularly like to thank my partner and collaborator in this venture, Sima Mittman of the Y, for all that she's done to make tonight's program possible. And now I'd like to turn over the program to John Ruskay.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, what do you need? For my first line, I need you here. A moderator is placed between speakers on an evening like this with an assigned role falling somewhere between master of ceremonies and a referee between combatants. If you came anticipating great fury, let me bring you in on a little secret. these men are very good friends, and despite differing views, hold each other in the greatest of respect.
And affection.
This is now a responsive reading. My role is therefore, rabbis will be rabbis. My role is therefore probably limited to the ceremonial. However, the opportunity we have may be greater, certainly more important than witnessing an epic struggle. It is, rather, to see if it is possible to discuss complex and highly charged public issues in a civil, probing, and intelligent way, without mudslinging or too many cliches. The background, qualifications, and personal relationships of our speakers makes this a realistic prospect. On to our subject, liberalism and the Jews, the collapse of a dream. The issue has been widely discussed, most recently in the Commentary Symposium, and certainly needs no introduction, particularly to this audience. However, after reading the symposium, we may be in need of some definitions. Therefore, in the first remarks of our speakers, might I request that each speaker devote but a few moments to a definition of the phenomena which he considers to be the liberalism he is either critiquing or affirming. Each speaker will begin with 15 to 20 minutes of introductory remarks. We will then spend approximately 30 minutes in discussion here at this table based on either the preliminary presentations or questions which I will pose. We will then entertain questions from the floor. It is a pleasure to call on Professor Irving Kristol.
Thank you. Some of you may be wondering what a neoconservative is. I'll tell you. A neoconservative is a Jewish liberal who has been mugged by reality. It happened to me quite a few years ago. It was not a disagreeable experience, but in any case, I really don't want to discuss neoconservatism tonight. I want to discuss liberalism. And I think if we're going to talk about the relationship between Jews and liberalism, we really must begin by achieving a great deal of detachment. Jews are interested in politics. Jews, in the majority, tend to be interested in liberal politics. It's very hard to take a look at liberalism today from a Jewish point of view without getting impassioned about it, without getting emotionally involved about it. But, you know, liberalism is a little over 200 years old. The Jews are over 2,000 years old. The Jews were here long before liberalism came into the world. The Jews will be here, I trust, long after liberalism has gone from the world. One must achieve a certain measure of detachment in order to understand what hundreds of years from now will be regarded as a very interesting and perhaps even important historical incident, namely the involvement of Jews with modern liberalism, or with liberalism in the modern world. What do we mean by liberalism? That question was asked by our chairman, and I have to answer it. Well, you really have to answer it historically, because there is no one thing that one can call liberalism. Liberalism in the modern world has gone through three phases in its history, in all of which the role of the Jews has been a very intimate one involving considerable expensive sentiment and of idealism. But we are now in the last phase, which is the problematic phase, and the one that creates a great deal of problems for Jews. The first phase was what we might call laissez-faire liberalism, namely the dissolution of the traditional European order and the establishment of a new order in which each individual had his rights and in which each individual had his opportunities as an individual, and in which the individual was the unit of social concern, of social action, and of political theory even. Jews welcomed this They welcomed this early 19th century laissez-faire liberalism because with the dissolution of the previous orders of society, defended then by conservatives, individual Jews for the first time had the opportunity to achieve the kind of fulfillment that had been forbidden them for centuries in the arts, in the sciences, in business. And they took advantage of that opportunity, and suddenly the world was open to them as individuals. Whether they were Jews or not did not matter. Though it was clear even then that this individualistic opportunity that liberalism offered to Jews did pose a kind of threat to Jews as Jews, in the sense that it also offered the possibility for the dissolution of the Jewish community. However, even though, and this is Arthur Hertzberg's field, and he knows it far better than I do, even though many of the original Jewish liberals did in fact become assimilated and converted, nevertheless, Jews who accepted individualistic liberalism were sufficiently confident of the institutions of the Jewish community, of the strength of the Jewish community, of Jewish traditions, that they really did not worry overly much as to what would happen to Judaism in a world in which every individual was looked upon and was counted simply as an individual, regardless, as we say, of race, creed, or color. And so while there was considerable unease, and certainly the Orthodox were terribly worried about the prospects of assimilation, it is a fact that the Jewish community enthusiastically welcomed this liberation from a restricted, I'll use the word feudal, inaccurate, but good enough for the purposes, a restricted feudal order into a world where every Jew really had the kind of opportunity that no Jew had had for 2,000 years. The second stage in the history of liberalism, 100 years later, around the turn of this century, is with the emergence of what we might call welfare state liberalism, not individualistic laissez-faire liberalism, but a liberalism which put the emphasis on the state making provision, first for the less fortunate members of the society, and secondly for all of those public goods which in fact a purely individualistic economy could not provide. And this was, too, very congenial to Jews. Jews are very familiar with institutions tending to the general welfare of the community. There was no way in which they could, unlike some of their Anglo-Saxon contemporaries, let us say, in this country, in which they could regard a welfare state as immoral or unwise. They had lived under a kind of welfare state in the shtetl. I mean, the institutions of the shtetl performed many of the same institutions which the liberal founders of the welfare state had in mind. Jews certainly have always understood moral responsibility and social responsibility for the less fortunate. They have always understood what economists call collective goods that cannot be provided by an individual but have to be decided communally. Indeed, it was the very idea and tradition of community and of communal responsibility that made it possible for Jews to welcome this new version of liberalism, no longer individualistic, no longer laissez-fairiste, but welfare state oriented, because, as I say, Jews in their communities had experience of such institutions and found that it is possible to live very happily, well, happily may be wrong, but to live contentedly and in what one would have to say is a fair degree of freedom, and they were not worried about enslavement by the welfare state as some of the more traditional individualist, laissez-fairist types were. So these two phases of liberalism, each in their different way, appealed to Jews legitimately. The one by offering Jews enormous opportunities, which they certainly took advantage of. The other by appealing to either a residual or active sense of Jewish community, what we call Jewish idealism, which is not idealism, it's the traditional institutions of the Jewish community. And Jews tended to see the emerging welfare state as replicating the traditional Jewish institutions for taking care of the less fortunate. And the politics of compassion, which characterizes the second stage of liberalism, was certainly very congenial to Jews. The third stage of liberalism begins, I don't know exactly when, sometime in the 1960s, I would guess, perhaps the early 1960s. And this is the liberalism we are grappling with today. It is not laissez-faire liberalism, Lord knows. It's no longer welfare state liberalism. We don't have a good term for it. I'll call it third world liberalism. It's a term. That is to say, it is a liberalism which rejects many of the principles of the two previous versions of liberalism, and indeed launches an attack on certain basic principles of civilization to which Jews have always been committed. This newer third world liberalism, now I would say the dominant form of active liberalism, and what am I talking about? I'm talking about the kind of liberalism that is, say, represented by the Americans for Democratic Action today, or the American Civil Liberties Union today. And those organizations are very different today from what they were 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. They have, as we say, moved sharply to the left. Third world liberalism has absorbed a whole set of radical attitudes, radical sentiments, and radical ideas which make the Jewish relationship to this liberalism extremely problematic. To take one very simple one, which I know Jewish liberals tend to overlook, the relationship of Jews to economic activity. Jewish success in modernity, Jewish success in the modern world, in Western Europe and the United States, is based on Jewish business success. A vulgar fact often overlooked by the children who become lawyers or physicists or musicians, but they only became musicians or lawyers or physicists because their fathers made enough money in business to send them to college and to support them through their first years while pursuing their professional careers. Under laissez-faire in liberalism, Jews did very well because Jews are very good in business. Unlike Christian Jews have never had an anti-business bias. Christianity has a problem with business. The New Testament does not, on the whole, take a very good view of business. The Old Testament is a very business-like document. There's nothing anti-business in the Old Testament. There's nothing anti-business in the Talmud, to the best of my knowledge. And of course, rabbis have been in business. Business is part of the Jewish tradition. We do not have the Christian problem, which Christianity being much more otherworldly, indeed anti-worldly religion, has always tended to dispraise self-interested economic activity. The Jewish tradition has never had any problem with self-interested economic activity, so long as it was within a framework, the framework of the law and the framework of communal responsibility. So Jews did very well in business under laissez-faire liberalism and it was their success in business that founded this institution and every Jewish institution you can think of, and indeed is responsible for the survival of the State of Israel. The welfare state, as I say, appealed to Jewish sentiments, did not threaten Jews in any way, not in their business capacities, not in their professional capacities, certainly not in their religious capacity as Jews. Third world liberalism, contemporary liberalism, is something else again. It is anti-capitalist. It is anti-business. That is to say, it wants the state to take over larger and larger areas of economic activity. Sometimes it's socialist, sometimes it's neo-socialist, sometimes it's quasi-socialist. I don't even know what the term socialist means. But the trend is clear. It wants the government to do more and more of the economic work of the nation, or try to. In my opinion, it's not possible, it won't work, and to exclude the traditional business community from that work. That is a very serious problem for Jews. I know it's not fashionable to mention this little fact, but the truth is, to the degree that the business community in this country is weakened, to that degree every existing Jewish institution is weakened. If the federal government was supporting this YMHA today, it would not be the same institution as it is, because it's supported by private Jewish funds. And that is true of the Jewish Theological Seminary. That is true of every Jewish institution. And of course it is true, as I say, of the State of Israel. So the fact that the new liberalism is collectivist, I can't think of it, corporatist, I don't know what word to use, anti-business in a way that previous liberalisms were not. Previous liberalisms may want to set certain bounds to business activity, set certain guidelines for business activity, but were not filled with an animus against the life of business per se, did not believe that business per se was immoral. The new liberalism does. It also, and this is perhaps most important, has as part of its momentum a culture that in its profoundest sense is anti-Jewish. And that is the culture, sometimes called the counterculture, whatever culture, whatever term you wish to use, that has emerged in the past 20 years. It's a very old intellectual and cultural tradition going back 100 years. It only has become a matter of mass consumption in the past 20 years. There was a time when in order to be considered a bohemian, you had to pretend to be an artist. Now, in order to be a bohemian, you have to pretend to appreciate art. That is the change that has taken place. The production of art has been replaced by the consumption art as a sign of cultural dissidence. The ethos, the moral view of the world, which is congenial to this latest third world liberalism, is, in my opinion, utterly incompatible with Judaism and with the historic traditions of Judaism. Its view of the family is incompatible. Its view of sexual relations is incompatible. Its view of the relations between parents and children is incompatible. Its attitude toward human life is incompatible with Jewish traditions. The culture associated with the third, and I would go so far as to say last version of liberalism, has turned out to be a culture with which anyone who has any feeling for Jewish tradition finds it very difficult to come to terms with, and I would say impossible to come to terms with. Liberalism, I mean, I if I wanted to sound pathetic and pointed, I could say liberalism has turned sour. I don't think that's fair. I mean, the world is what it is, and history what it is, and things become what they become, and liberalism has become what it has become. It has become a force in the modern world which is basically either indifferent to or hostile to what I would even go so far as to call the Judeo-Christian ethos. I mean, it really does not like the basic ethos, as much characteristic of Christianity as of Judaism, that has been the ethos of Western civilization for 2,000 years now. It is anti-Western civilization. Everything is now permitted unless someone makes a profit on it. And you get into this peculiar situation of the modern world. I can think of no more striking example of what I will call decadent liberalism, but which is really the third stage of liberalism. 100 years ago, it was illegal for a girl of 18 to fornicate in public for money. I mean, that she would have been arrested, the sponsors would have been arrested, the promoters would have been arrested. The obscenity and pornography laws made that illegal. Today, it is legal, but only if she gets paid the minimum wage. Now, there's a certain set of priorities involved here. You know, does a father or mother care more whether her 18-year-old daughter is fornicating in public for the amusement of spectators, or does she care more and more whether she's doing so at a certain wage? We have reached a state, and this is modern liberalism, which, you know, basic traditional family values have been gutted, and I would say not destroyed, because I don't think they can be destroyed, but certainly deeply wounded. And liberalism has done this. The dynamic of modern liberalism has done this. Modern liberalism has become a destructive and, I think, self-destructive force. I don't think it can create anything. There are no new ideas coming out of modern liberalism except destructive ideas. Ideas borrowed from alien civilizations, ideas borrowed from anti-Western thinkers. This modern form of liberalism, it seems clear to me, can in no way be reconciled with the survival of the Jewish people and with Jewish religious traditions. And I think that it is time Jews really sat down and began to take thought of their new condition and come to certain conclusions about it. Thank you.
Professor Hertzberg?
I know very well that there are going to be some questions and then there's going to be some discussion, and therefore the time for what might appear to be rebuttal is later. And I'm starting not in the spirit of rebuttal, but in the spirit of continuing a discussion. Let me say, by the way, that I meant my interjection before. Irving Kristol and I are the oldest of old friends. We began together as sub-editor and writer way back.
Don't let that get in your way.
It won't. I'm about to use a midrash, Irving. We began together way back yonder in commentary back in 1949, but I'm conscious of an old midrash which says that only on the way to a debate and on the way from a debate are you supposed to be ohavim. In the middle of a debate, you're supposed to be oivim, supposed to conduct an adversary proceeding. I think in the first place, Irving, that what you've been kind of weeping for, which is the disintegration of traditional values, is not the fault of liberalism, but is the secularization of the last couple of centuries. The disintegration of traditional values have been happening across the board. And as a matter of fact, the first Jews who were aware of the fact that the post-medieval, post-ghetto world would bring all this with it were the Hasidim who responded to Napoleon by saying Napoleon would be bad for Judaism, he might be good for Jews. And for that matter, even earlier in the debates in the 1790s when in the Batavian Republic, the issue of whether Jews really wanted equal rights was seriously debated out. There were traditionalists who said, no, we're better off without it, provided we can maintain our separatist community. And so, you know, I often wonder when I hear this kind of parlance, whether what is being expressed is the kind of yearning for an older tradition which works very nicely if God is not dead and all things are therefore not permitted, which is really an oblique and polite way of saying that I sometimes wonder about neoconservatism and the upholding of the traditional Jewish values as they are generally upheld nowadays by political figures who tend to be rather secularist, whose sense of what life is about is still a fairly secularist life. But that is not really the main burden of what of my problem with neoconservatism. Let me begin by saying that I doubt your history. The kind of liberalism that you and I associate myself with you on that, you and I don't like. The liberalism of the necessity to say four-letter words, the liberalism of the busts of the late 60s, and so on, the liberalism of the disintegration of the traditional values, is not really a new phenomenon. It's not nearly a new phenomenon. And for that matter, its anti-Jewishness in the hands of Jews is not nearly a new phenomenon. The Mark Rudds of this earth are only a more vulgar version of much more interesting people, such as Rosa Luxemburg, who, coming from Zamość, said, "Don't bother me with the Jewish people, I've got the world to worry about." And for that matter, the liberals who are impatient with Jewish particularism and wish it would go away, the kinds who are pro-PLO, many of them, some of them Jewish, are not really very much different from the Narodniki of the early 1880s, some of them Jewish, who found the pogroms to be a merited expression of the angers of the proletariat against their Jewish oppressors. And for that matter, the Jacobins, and as I once argued in a book, Voltaire before them, were totally impatient with Jews in the name of a new world of total regeneration. It seems to me, therefore, that there are really two kinds of liberal tradition, John. There is liberal totalitarianism, as totalitarian liberalism, which, by the way, is the obverse of totalitarian counter-liberalism. There is the notion that some kind of a new heaven and new earth can be brought to this earth. And by the way, there are certain Jewish phenomena which belong to this. There are some elements in Zionism which have about them this notion that there is some kind of new messianic birth, that on this earth the Messiah is going to be made to arrive by human action. There is thus the liberalism which believes that a new heaven, that a new world is to be born. And when that liberalism fails, as among the gods that failed, it spawns or gives birth to former totalitarian liberals, some of my best friends among them, who start thinking about the new world as, yes, about to be born, but it ought to be born according to more conservative prescriptions. Now, my difficulty with all of that is quite autobiographical. I have not yet reached middle age, because if middle age in the Jewish tradition is the middle of the allotted span, and the allotted span is 120, none of us on this platform have quite reached 60. So I'm not quite ready for middle age. But if middle-aged people are supposed to be conservative, I suspect that the people who turn conservative and neoconservative tend to be people who once as young people thought that the radical, not the radical solutions, were going to give birth to a new world. And then they look at the results and they say, what a disaster. We better reaffirm in order to keep the world together or to bring some semblance of order into this world, we better reaffirm or affirm some other values. I've never believed that the Messiah was going to come. I wasn't a radical in the 30s, and I am not a counter-revolutionary today. I belong as a liberal to the other liberal tradition. The tradition of people such as Montesquieu, the tradition of English liberalism, the tradition, for that matter, of American liberalism, which in its majority tradition is untidy, pragmatic, and humanitarian. For instance, Voltaire sometimes in the 18th century pretended that he could regenerate the Jews totally and make them worthy of being part of mankind. They would become philosophes. But most of the time, when he decided that they couldn't become philosophes, he said, off with their heads. Let's get rid of them. Montesquieu is capable of saying that he doesn't think the Jews are much good. I quote him exactly, that they didn't produce in all the centuries since the Bible a single genius, a single intellect, even of the third rank. But then he says over and over again, but one oughtn't kill them, and one ought to allow them some room within society. Now, if you imagine that you're trying to create the new heaven and the new earth, you reach very bold conclusions. And if the boldnesses don't work, you're in trouble. If you imagine that you are trying somehow or other to live through your own generation and to go on to the next, you reach certain untidy, workable answers. Now, if Irving is not ashamed to say that to defend Jewish business, and I'm not ashamed to defend it either, one of the more interesting things that I've lately discovered, by the way, is that when the Jews first came to Manhattan in 1654, the 23 who came, Peter Stuyvesant was not really quite as nasty as the average history book tells you. He was willing, briefly, to let them stay, provided they'd go up into Harlem and farm. And these 23 resisted economic restratification. They insisted on the right to keep shop near the Battery, and that was what the battle was about. But if Irving is not ashamed of Jewish business, I'm not ashamed of the question of good for Jews or bad for Jews. But then I ask for real the question. If we are agreed that the total social revolution, a la Rosa Luxemburg, or Leon Trotsky, or Marx before him, does not produce a place for the Jews within society which is secure and incontrovertible, especially if Jews try to crowd up the intelligentsia of the revolutionary society. If we are agreed on that, does it follow from that in the less tidy capitalist society, we must be the spear-bearers of all the confrontationist doctrines? I do not think that it is good for Jews to have been the chief cheerleaders of the battle against blacks over affirmative action. I think it's bad for Jews. I do not think that continuing this battle in a changing society within which we are going to have to work out and rework our intergroup relations with others, that in such a society, for us to insist on absolutes, now neoconservative absolutes, identified as merit or identified as unalterable as the laws of the Medes and the Persians, for us to insist on that without any untidy flexibility does not seem to me in the long run to be good for Jews. It may in the short run be good for some Jews. It is not in the long run good for the Jewish community, precisely because it casts us for the role of a battle which with some flexibility we might be able to compromise. Without flexibility we cannot compromise it at all. I do not think that the role for Jews is to be the chief spear-bearers of the Cold War, not even at a bad moment in American-Soviet relations. I got a letter just this morning from a friend of mine, associate in one of the things that I happen to still be involved in the Jewish community, from Australia. One of the leaders internationally in the battle for Soviet Jewry. And he tells me, as a matter of cold turkey fact, that the cancellation of the Olympics means that there is deep trouble ahead. Deep trouble has already begun for the Jewish refuseniks and for those Jews who had hoped under the cover of the Olympics to get out. Now, I do not know that there is a very hard doctrinaire answer to the relationship of Jews to the issues raised by the Soviet Union. But I do know that the Jewish issues and the Cold War issues, though they are intertwined, are separable. And that to the degree to which we can make some distance between the two, we give ourselves some give. I do not believe, to turn to one more very difficult issue, I do not believe, and I think very immediate experience has proved it, I do not believe, and I think experience has alas proved it, that one of the famous doctrines of the Jewish right, which is the doctrine that when the United States finally stands up to the Soviet Union, the defense of Israel will be secure, has been proved by experience. The United States is at the moment doing everything within its power to find some way of organizing its anti-Soviet policy in the Middle East while distancing itself from Israel, at least as a military matter. At least distancing itself from Israel publicly. What therefore is to me the moral of the story is that so long as you believe that the Messiah is around the corner and you do not find him, if I may quote a slightly foreign source, if you do not find him in the Messiah at whose table you sat, then perhaps you deny him and go looking for some other. If you never imagine that the Messiah is coming, if you imagine only that Jews are in Golos and that the Golos remains, that the situation even after the emancipation is a situation of not quiteness, we're not quite equal, not quite unequal. If you imagine that if you survey the situation of Jews in the world as a situation in which we somehow or other work it out, then you arrive at a kind of untidy, pragmatic flexibility. Now, this is, I think, much more consonant with at least rabbinic morality. And by rabbinic, I don't mean rabbis of this day. I don't mean rabbis. I mean rabbinic morality, Talmudic morality. This is consonant with the Talmudic sense of what the world is about and what the Jewish moral obligation within the world is. To be decent, case by case, in difficult times, to try to make the world a bit better, and to try to help the Jews survive. I want one last sentence, and that is, I am frightened to death for the Jews of the conservative confrontationist temper of this age. The enemies of Jewish survival are those who imagine that we can draw up a list of all those people we don't like, find adequate rationalizations for not liking them, and say we'll sick the law on you. The law is a creation of society. It is a creation of the ongoing and reworked social compacts. And unless we can work out our social relationships in a rapidly and fundamentally changing America and in the world, then there are too few of us and too many of them for us to pound as many tables as we persist in pounding. And therefore, eloquent and elegant and civilized and full of high principle as Jewish neoconservatism is, I think it is the single most dangerous doctrine that is presently around in the Jewish community, almost as dangerous as the left.
Thank you. I have no doubt that each speaker during the questioning will be able to rebut or add those comments that they think are necessary. So let me start with a question. You want some water? Yeah. All right. A question really of both, but I just want to add a couple of comments on Professor Kristol. They are, number one, somebody was just briefing me on this today, that I believe, but it's very close at this point, there is probably more governmental money, as I understand it, coming into this institution than money that comes from the Federation. Two, for example, as well, probably the amount of liberal government, in a sense, money that goes to the state of Israel at this point is probably conservatively 5 times greater than comes from private sources, if not 10 times greater. So I just, at some point, like to integrate that. Second of all, it strikes me as a slight contradiction, the notion that you want less government, but then when you discuss the prostitution case, if that's what we might call, it strikes me that that is in some ways an example of the restricted role of government.
Are you for legalized prostitution, Rabbi?
I am not a rabbi.
Damn.
Am I for legalized prostitution? Well, I'm just wanting to put that question to you. Am I for legalized prostitution? I think I'm probably for the state not having a role in that.
You want vigilantes to cope with this. I mean, you're for legalized prostitution?
Let me
You're saying you don't want the
share
state
that
to
with
have
you. If you feel, that's the retort, that's fair. I just want to share that comment with you. By way of introduction, so I wanted to help bring this down to some questions that I think might be concerned with some in the audience. The term quotas, this is really for both. I'll ask Professor Kristol first. The term quotas and affirmative action often appear in discussions about liberalism, social policy, neoconservatism. Do you see the distinctions as important? If so, in what ways? Is there any part of this that you see as important for the next decade?
First of all, let me say very briefly that to the degree that this institution or the state of Israel is dependent on American government dollars, it's in great peril. The less dependent it is on governmental dollars, the better. Just as the American government will get something in return from Israel out of those dollars, perhaps not in Israel's interest, so we'll get something from the YMHA out of those dollars. And HEW will be coming around, if it hasn't already. I assume it already has. And you will be filling out all of those forms, and suddenly you will discover that you have certain obligations which you didn't realize you have, which have been imposed upon you by governmental bureaucracy. As far as, there being a paradox about getting government involved in morality, for instance, whereas I'm for limited government, how can this possibly be a paradox? My view on this matter is the view of the Founding Fathers and of all Americans up until the year 1960. This is the way the country was ever since its founding, namely that government has a proper role in public morality, always had. But that government is less productive when it interferes in the economic area. That's what the Founding Fathers believed. That's what all Americans believed. Up until yesterday, that was the common assumption in which all Americans breathed. Suddenly, it becomes a paradox. It reminds me of my students when we discuss pornography in class. They say, well, if you have censorship pornography, doesn't that mean political censorship? I point out we had censorship of pornography in this country ever since the beginning. Again, up until around the year 1960, and we had no significant political censorship. One thing doesn't necessarily follow from the other. Let me say this about the rabbi here. I don't use that term in any opprobrious way. I have great respect for rabbis, in principle, in the abstract. But Arthur says he is in the tradition of Anglo-Saxon liberalism. Fine, so am I. Good. That is the neoconservative tradition, the tradition of Montesquieu, of Locke, of Hume, of Adam Smith, of the Founding Fathers, of Tocqueville. It is a philosophy of limited government. It is a philosophy of a predominantly market economy. It is a philosophy, it is a system in which Jews, on the whole, have prospered, have done very well, have been very secure, wherever that system prevailed. What has happened in the last 2 decades is that what we call liberalism has been infused with all of those elements that Arthur called radicalism or Jacobinism, if you wish. Liberalism today, what we call liberalism today, no longer is the Anglo-Saxon liberal tradition. It is another tradition deriving from the European continent, not from England and the United States. And it is a messianic tradition, a messianic political tradition. It is a tradition that aims at creating a new world on the ruins of the old. It is a tradition which says God is dead, everything is permitted, and if everything is permitted, we shall all recover the authentic humanity that civilized restrictions have taken away from us. That, in my view, is precisely what neoconservatism is. Let me say something about affirmative action, since that seems to get in. There is a matter of principle here. The idea of affirmative action, as interpreted by government agencies, not as written into the law, as interpreted by government agencies and as upheld by the courts, is utterly incompatible with the Anglo-Saxon conception of a liberal polity for one very simple reason. It means that the government goes around treating you not as an individual citizen, but not only asking you, are you black, Jewish, Hispanic, Oriental, what have you, but then having to determine whether in fact you are. You cannot have affirmative action without government deciding who is black. How is the government to have affirmative action for blacks without having an official definition of blackness? Incidentally, we already have one for Indianness. I don't know if you're aware of it. If you think you're Indian and apply for a scholarship under the HEW program, you have to prove that you're 1/4 Indian. If you're 1/4 Indian, you're Indian. If you're 1/8 Indian, does you no good whatsoever. We already have the government officially declaring who is an Indian and who is not. In the door of that tent being open, not only is the camel's nose in, but the camel's hump is already practically in. We are going to have governmental involvement in government organization of society on the basis of ethnic, religious, and racial groups. Jews have never prospered and cannot prosper in any such society because they are not a large and, through force of numbers, an influential group. Now, in fact, I don't think affirmative action has been all that disastrous so far. But the principle involved is an absolutely crucial one. It is utterly incompatible with the Anglo-Saxon tradition of liberalism. And once you let it get accepted, you are on your way toward having a completely different kind of society.
Well, you know, I have trouble with this whole business about government interference. I hear Irving making a distinction between government interference in the moral realm, where government should be the enforcer of the moral consensus of society. Did I hear you correctly, Irving?
Yes.
That's the prostitution example. And government interference in all other places where it's a very bad deal indeed. Now, it seems to me that, as a matter of fact, your a terrible example of government asking us to fill out forms is a matter of degree and not of kind. Remember that lots of things in the United States, including the churches and the synagogues, run to a considerable degree on income tax exemptions, which any purist would argue against. The universities, for that matter, even before the government started to give them money directly, it was giving them quite lots of money indirectly. I do not think that what we are dealing with is a matter of kind. We are dealing with a matter of degree. There are some things that, again, using my sense of the untidiness of reality, there are some things which government should be involved in, some things which government should not be involved in. Let me take your prostitution example a bit further. By the way, I personally feel very keenly that the moral standards of society should be upheld. What about the moral standards of society on abortion, where we are locked in combat, and where I, as a traditionalist, am against abortion wholesale and for abortion only retail, case by case, in good rabbinic jurisprudence. But I would be very much worried if we asked the government to enact that rule for the whole of society, as we've been fighting, some of us, against having the government enact Catholic morals for the whole of society. So what we're really talking about is a kind of limited consensus with some give in it, which consensus does change. Now, you and I may be unhappy with some of the changes that some people are suggesting, but that doesn't yet make a case, it seems to me, for saying that the traditionalists are against government interference and the anti-traditionalists want more government. We tend to want more government on those values which we care about and less government on those values on which we would like to have our own head. And I do not see a vast philosophical case here being made. I think it's a game. Now, that, however, leads me to another observation. The rhetoric with which the nastinesses of the 1960s and the 1970s are being attacked is the rhetoric with which the same nastinesses in Weimar were being attacked. I mean, you know, everybody goes to Mahagoni right now and sees it, hears it on the Met stage as a very quaint and charming expression of the bitterness of the 1920s. But in situ, in its own time, Mahagoni was a scandal, and it was the scandal of exactly the same proportions as some of the things that we are presently inveighing against. I get worried by this kind of attack, not because I like either Weimar or the Columbia bust, which began under my own window back in '68. I get worried about it because I am even more worried about repressions. I have a very gingerly feeling about that, which leads me to the last point, that very difficult and vexed point, which we can get very emotional, which is affirmative action. The notion being that affirmative action, Irving just propounded it, is totally antithetical to Anglo-Saxon ideas. To which Anglo-Saxon ideas, Irving? To the Anglo-Saxon ideas in the Constitution, which declared blacks to be 3/5 of a person for the purposes of districting congressional districts, but for other purposes they were slaves, to Anglo-Saxon ideas in England, which deal in which there is a perfect democracy, except that it's a monarchy, and it is still a legal question whether a Jew can be the Lord Chancellor of England, to all kinds of untidinesses that are within the Anglo-Saxon tradition. I think the Anglo-Saxon tradition is precisely the tradition of allowing all kinds of queernesses, which then really raises the question of whether being a little bit pregnant with affirmative action is good for Jews or bad for Jews. I'll take what you have said. The amount of affirmative action that has happened around us has not been that disastrous to Jews. To the degree to which it has happened, it has diffused some of the angers. It is a Jewish interest that there be an increasing black and other minority middle class with a stake in the stability of the society. It is a Jewish interest that those elements not be turned against the social consensus. And therefore, precisely being a little bit pregnant with affirmative action, and not necessarily, and not at all on quotas. I think affirmative action is something that can be managed without the quota system, and is to a large degree being so managed. Let me say one more thing. In this argument about affirmative action, I find it interesting that the one country in which Jews are in control, in Israel, there is affirmative action, and nobody raises the issue. If you are a Sephardi, you get X number of advantages, including some extra points on your bagrut, on your examinations, and some extra points getting into university, because it is good for society. And I remember when I spent 6 months in Israel teaching back in '71, the big brouhaha, the big outcry then was there only 4% of the Sephardim are part of the university. Over half of them in the elementary schools, about 15 or 18% were then graduating the high schools, and only 4% were in the universities. And the argument then was that it is good for Israel that there be more Sephardim as university graduates, because you'll have then fewer Black Panthers. In Israel, the decision was made that this was a social good. Israel, after all, being the expression of a good number of our contemporary Jewish ideals, and so it goes until it will become unnecessary. I do not understand why this passes so quietly in Israel within the world Jewish community, and is such a brouhaha in the United States, when the issues are mutatis mutandis the same. The issues of social peace and what is good for a Jewish elite, which ought to move over just a little bit in order that the Jewish community not be clobbered as a whole.
Professor Hertzberg, liberals during, I would say, the past 5-10 years have been faulted for their identification with two issues: leniency regarding the criminal justice system and a perception that liberals place less importance on a strong American military posture. Do you see these as inherent requisites of a liberal position?
No, no. As a matter of fact, on domestic matters, a man with whom I've broken a lance or two, Henry Jackson, is an old New Deal liberal. He happens to be a New Deal liberal who holds the view of a quite strong military posture. If you're talking of, if what you mean by liberalism is ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, that's a different matter. That's a different matter. What you mean by liberalism is a sense of the pragmatic, humanitarian, libertarian reenactment of social peace in America and variant views about that and about how America plays its role in the world, then it is quite consonant with different perceptions of of America's role in the world. Let me go back to an old quarrel. There were two reasons, at least, for opposing the war in Vietnam. There were those who opposed the war in Vietnam, and they made the most noise for quite a long time, because some of them really wanted America humiliated. And there were some who opposed the war in Vietnam because they thought it was bad for America, and because, contrary to the Jewish hardliners in those days, they felt that the humiliation of America in a war that it was going to lose, or rather a war it couldn't win, given what America was and what tools America would use, would inevitably make it harder for the cause of Israel, the cause of the defense of small countries. Now, that second perception of the Vietnamese war, label it what you will, is the kind of perception out of which I am speaking. I am not arguing the cause of the left. I regard the left and the right as deserving each other. And I think that the left and the right, for all of their arguments with each other, are nurtured by the same sources. I am arguing the cause of the middle.
A last question before I entertain questions.
Can I talk?
I'm going to ask you a question, then you can.
Go ahead.
Okay, and the question is simply, you have been somewhat critical of liberal social and economic problems. Would you just briefly outline the kinds of programs you would advocate for dealing with the social problems that remain in America in a brief way, a neoconservative position?
Let me say, first of all, Arthur's liberalism, which I respect, has one unfortunate characteristic. It's dead. It's the liberalism of John Dewey, the liberalism associated with that school of thought. It doesn't exist as a viable force in the United States today. Its place has been taken by quite another kind of liberalism. If American liberalism today were the kind of liberalism you find so agreeable, we would not be having this debate. Even though I might have my differences with that kind of liberalism, my goodness, there would not be very strong differences. They would be extremely minor ones. Your problem is that you have been stranded, as the Marxists would say, by the tides of history, holding on to a liberalism which is not the liberalism to be found in the United States today. It's not the liberalism to be found in our traditional liberal organizations, not the liberalism for the most part to be found in our traditional liberal media, not the liberal tradition to be found in the traditional institutions of Western Europe. And I think that is your problem. On the question of foreign affairs, let me say a word on that. I don't know precisely what the Jewish interest is, except this. If you believe, as I do, that this nation and the principles it incarnates, the basic Anglo-Saxon liberal principles, are good, or at least better than anything else that seems to be around, far better, then you do want to see the United States strong. You do want to see the United States having a powerful influence in the world. You do not want to see the United States in disarray, which is what will happen if in foreign affairs the United States is in a constant position of retreating. I am, I suppose, what Arthur would call hawkish in foreign affairs. I had a third position in Vietnam. I really don't know whether it made any sense for us ever to get involved.
Right.
I don't know. Once we got involved, we should have won. That's my view. It was my view then. We could have won. We didn't, because the war was conducted in an absolutely incredibly stupid way. We not only killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese unnecessarily, we killed tens of thousands of Americans unnecessarily, perhaps millions of Cambodians unnecessarily, and that is indeed our fault. I think we have a responsibility for that. As far as the Cold War is concerned, I don't know what the phrase means. We have a conflict in the world between certain nations led by the United States, which represents certain traditions of Judeo-Christian civilization, certain traditions of liberalism, and we have a lot of the world which does not only not represent those traditions, but which is hostile to those traditions. I'm on one side. Israel, thank God, is also on that side. Doesn't mean there won't be problems between the United States and Israel in foreign affairs. There are bound to be, and to the degree that Israel relies on the United States for its salvation, I think that is a very foolish thing for it to do. Israel should rely on Israel for its salvation. I don't want to see Israel dependent utterly on the United States, because I don't trust the American government with regard to Israel. After all, the American government may decide it's in American interest, and indeed it may even be in American interest, to sacrifice Israeli interests for the sake of the United States. I would like to see Israel in a position to defend its own interests, and therefore to be strong enough to conduct a foreign policy. And for that it has to have a very different kind of economic policy than the one it has, which is now draining the country of its wealth, draining the country of its economic energy. Israel is about the only place in the world where Jews do badly in economic life. What is the neoconservative view on solving our social problems? Well, the wisest word on this whole matter of solving our social problems was said to me by an Israeli, the former Minister of Defense in the Labor government. What's his name?
Minister of Defense in the Labor government.
Yeah.
Shimon Peres.
Shimon Peres, right. This was at a dinner in New York way back, right when Mr. Carter was elected. And it was a dinner for Shimon Peres, and there were some 20 journalists there and government officials cross-examining him about Israeli policy, and he was holding his own and doing very well. And at some point, Ed Sheehan, who was a very pro-Arab journalist, said, Mr. Minister, what about the problem of the old city of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem? And Peres looked at him and said, East Jerusalem, it's no problem. And we all looked at Peres quizzically, and Sheehan said rather timidly, Minister, what did you mean when you said East Jerusalem is no problem? And Peres shrugged his shoulders again and said, in politics, if you don't have a solution, you don't have a problem. And it was the wisest thing I ever heard a politician say. He went on to say, what you have is a condition. And people live with medical conditions. You don't call them problems. They're conditions. You have hay fever. It's a condition. You cope with it. We have in this country an awful lot of conditions that we insist on calling problems. And we insist on thinking that there's something called a, quote, solution, unquote, to them. And we spend a lot of money, and we have very grand programs, and then we get this quickly disillusioned. The fact of the matter is, we have one solution to most of our social problems. I won't say to all. And that solution is economic growth. What do you do about the ghetto? What can you do about the ghetto? The main thing you can do about the ghetto is what you did about the Jewish ghetto. If you have economic growth, people leave the ghetto, they get jobs, their children then go to college, get better jobs, and that's the way it has been in the history of this country and in the history of other Western countries. That, I mean, it's like going to the sweatshops on the East Side in 1960, say, what is the solution to this problem? You know, in 1904, a man named Hunter wrote a book on poverty in New York City in which he said, the Jews of New York City are trapped in a permanent cycle of poverty. There is no way they are ever going to go out. The government has to do something radical about this situation because their condition is simply impossible. But they got out. Of course, everyone gets out, and the blacks will get out. We keep talking about the blacks as if they were, you know, wards of the state, as if they were mentally incompetent or something. Give the economic growth that this nation is accustomed to, and the blacks will participate. Therefore, I am for economic policies which help sustain and generate economic growth, not economic policies which frustrate economic growth. Some of my liberal friends think it's possible to have economic growth with high levels of taxation, high levels of governmental regulation of business, high levels of government interference with the economic life of the country. And that is because they have some peculiar conception, it's a very liberal conception, that there's something called the economy on the one hand and business on the other. There is no one economy on the one hand and business on the other. Business is the economy. If you want economic growth, you have to encourage business enterprise. Literally encourage business enterprise, not regard it as some suspect form of activity. That is the way it has been in this country. That's the way we solved our, quote, social problems, unquote, for 200 years. That's the way we're going to solve them in the 20, 30, 40 years ahead. All of those government programs that were supposed to have solved our social problems have not, and in many cases have made them much worse. Economic growth, I think, is the traditional American, if you wish, Anglo-Saxon liberal answer to these problems. It's the only answer I know of.
I'd like to, at this point, entertain questions. Glenn Halpin.
I think I understand the question, but I'm not absolutely sure. You know, I have no political prescription for Jews at the moment. I don't go around saying Jews should be neoconservative or any such thing. I do say Jews should disengage themselves from their historic attachment to liberalism because liberalism has disengaged itself from them. The historical attachment, which I described, had very deep and genuine roots. I mean, there was a good reason for the Jewish attachment to liberalism for 200 years. I think those reasons have now withered. I think Jews have to find themselves, start thinking with detachment about the new world they are in. It's a very dangerous world they are in. Jews, you know, as I say, Jews existed long before liberalism, and Jews faced political problems long before liberalism. Jewish conservatism is nothing new. I mean, most Orthodox Judaism traditionally has been very conservative politically. I'm not recommending that either. All I'm saying is that I think it is time, in fact, I think it is happening and will happen, that the Jewish community in this country disengage itself from a liberal affiliation which in many ways is beginning to strangle it and makes it more and more political, impotent, and begin to look very realistically and coolly at the political situation in which they find themselves. I don't ask for more than that.
Jeff?
Professor Kristol, you mentioned the success of American Jewry as being due largely to business, or Jewish success in business. I question this historically. If you look at the masses of Jewish immigrants who came and settled, for example, in New York City, most of them were not successful businessmen. In fact, they were often at odds with Jewish businessmen who were exploiting them in the factories. In fact, their success was largely due to public education on the higher levels, on the university level. That was a liberal idea, that education on the college level should be free. And large numbers of Jews became successful in government and in their professions due to this liberal public education. In fact, the New Deal opened government jobs to Jews and gave many Jews success. So one could make a case that Jewish success in this country was due to some degree to liberal ideas as well.
No. As a fact, I would not deny that. I mean, I've said Jews have benefited from their historic connection with liberalism, which is why Jews, who are not usually stupid, have in fact been liberal. There's a perfectly good reason for it. I would, I think, argue the point. I think I would say that the commercial success of the Jewish business community, not obviously of everyone in the Jewish community, but of an awful lot within the Jewish community, laid the basis for eventual Jewish participation in higher education at all levels, including the elite colleges, Jewish entry into the professions, and in general, Jewish prominence in the arts. I think Jewish money has played a crucial role in that, but I will say, okay, it's historically arguable. I think we'll agree that it played a role. Jackson, no. Kennedy, yes. Jackson, no. Jackson's an old liberal, just like Arthur Hertzberg here. A dying breed, which is why he never got the nomination. Kennedy, Carter, yes. McGovern, yes. I mean, the people who dominate the party now, the Democratic Party, yes. The people who go to the Democratic nominating convention, yes. And I'll defer to Arthur Hertzberg on the Jewish traditional attitude toward business, which I did not realize there was any controversy. What they call the Protestant ethic is the Jewish ethic, is the Hebraic ethic. And of course prophets denounce greed, but greed is not business. I mean, avarice is not business. You don't have to be greedy to be in business. It's not regarded as right to be greedy, but to work and to make money was never a disgrace in any Jewish community that I ever knew of, whereas Christianity has always been much more ascetic and otherworldly. Now, I'll leave it to the rabbi to decide whether I'm right or wrong on that.
This time I want to call on the rabbi to comment.
Well, first of all, on the matter of business, Irving couldn't be more right. One quarter of the Shulchan Aruch is devoted to a volume called the Choshen Mishpat, which is all about business ethics. There is a business ethic, but business by definition is not bad. It is, after all, not in the Talmud that you find the idea that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. For the Talmudists in the room, let me remind you that one of the slightly worrisome passages in the Talmud is Rebbe Mechabed Ashirim, that Rabbi Judah the Prince used to have a proper and decent respect for the wealthy. Obviously, wealth is not by definition, or business success is not by definition proof positive that someone is wicked. But I want to break a lance with you, Irving, about something else. You talked about Jews as getting into society for the last couple of centuries during a vast stage of expanding capitalism. And you hold out that promise also to blacks and to all the other minorities bidding for place in America, that it will happen to them as this capitalist society expands further, and this American capitalist society. And then you talk occasionally of this new and much more dangerous world in which we are. Well, I think that the dimensions of the new and the much more dangerous world in which we are A, that this expanding capitalism in which the United States has been using something of the order of a quarter of the raw resources of the world, is now beginning to backfire on us some, and the certainties that capitalism is going to expand further, certainly in an American direction, is very much of a concern. But I am rather more interested in breaking a lance with you on another issue which hasn't turned up above the surface yet. I think there's an image of the world and the kind of things you've been saying, an image of America rather, in which America is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country that it still pretended to be when we were young. And somehow or other, our generation and the one thereafter, our generation really, lived through and thinks it had a hand in opening this world to a meritocracy to which you and I and our contemporaries belong. I don't think that world is around anymore. The WASP world is dead. The proof positive of it is that college presidencies, which used to be reserved for the WASP establishment, are now going to Jews. That simply proves that it has become a dangerous profession, being a college president, and now marginal, and is now being handed on to people other than the old establishment. We are not in that America anymore. That very dangerous world we're talking about is a much more plural, much more fragmented world, in which, yes, we're going to have to forge all kinds of new alliances, in which the rules of the game, the rules of the road are different. And it is precisely out of the sense that the world is radically different, and perhaps a little narrower, that I think in terms of again working out some untidy relationships. Now, you may tell me that the old liberalism is dead. As a matter of fact, it is still the mainstream of the American Jewish community. That is what American Jews think. Give or take a couple of percentage points, give or take an issue or two, the kind of thing that I'm saying tonight is pretty well the political doctrine of most American Jews, including even some of them who vote Republican. Now, we may be as a totality irrelevant, but as a matter of fact, it is our sense that a society which does not polarize and which is moderately reformist is good for us. A society which polarizes is bad for us, which continues to be the political doctrine that we're trying to uphold. We may we may be wrong. We may be wrong. But this, and not 2 centuries of Jewish commitment to liberalism, this sense of holding the darned world together somehow or other so that it doesn't blow up in our faces, and keeping it going with with a continuing commitment to reform, which is an older idea for Jews than liberalism. It is the idea of good for Jews or bad for Jews in a non-angry, that good for Jews is a less angry world and a less polarized one. And therefore, I think, as a matter of fact, that this dangerous new world that you're talking about is dangerous and new precisely because all the wonders and the glories of expanding capitalism haven't saved it, have brought it into lots of trouble, into some dead ends, and that the various nostrums, capitalist or ultra-left, do not work, and that something other than the two of them needs again to be reaffirmed.
You're absolutely right, Arthur, in saying that your views are the dominant stream of thought within the Jewish community, which is my problem. Mm-hmm. I think it's the wrong stream of thought. On capitalism, there are no glories to capitalism. Mm-hmm. It is a very prosaic economic system, a very boring economic system. All it does, if permitted to, is produce economic growth. Mm-hmm. That's all. It doesn't solve all the problems in the world, and by God, it certainly does create new problems. Mm-hmm. It creates problems associated with affluence. It creates what we call the problem of youthful alienation among affluent young people who, for one reason or another, don't find the idea of participating in economic growth attractive. Yes, all of this is absolutely true. And I know of no economic or social system that doesn't create problems. To the degree that you succeed in whatever it is you do, you create new problems. And indeed, the growth of capitalism has created new problems. But I do believe, contrary to what you said, that economic growth is still a real possibility, that we can experience it, that the resource problem is not a serious one. Switzerland is continuing to grow. Japan is continuing to grow without any resources. The only resource that you need for economic growth is people who are willing to think and willing to work, and then you get economic growth, and you need nothing else. And I think we have the people. I think plenty of other countries have that people, which is why I'm optimistic about economic growth and its impact upon some of our problems. It's not going to solve all of our problems. I don't know of anything that's going to solve all of our problems. Let me say one word about polarization. I have no desire to polarize American politics. I agree with you. Polarized politics is not only very dangerous for Jews, it's dangerous for a liberal political community. Right. But I am not engaged in polarizing anything or anyone. I am very moderate. It is, I think, the liberals who are engaged in polarizing this society on issue after issue. And I use the word liberals not to include you, but in accord with the earlier definition I gave, namely the activist liberals of today, who are very different from yesterday's liberals. And while you're not yet middle-aged, Arthur, you are yesterday's liberal.
I want to entertain a last question here.
I would like to pick up a comment that Rabbi Hertzberg made and add a little more emphasis. I believe both gentlemen are talking in what I might term theoretical terms. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, and I enjoy it. But I think both of you are forgetting the reality of life, and in particular, Dr. Kristol. When you say all you need for growth is people, you are behind the times. The United States
if I may speak first. It's a great pleasure for me to say at this point that you have posed a problem to which there is a simple solution. Economic growth is not hard. It's easy. Yes, we consume 40% of the world's energy. What percent of the world's goods do we produce? 40%? Well, I mean, you know, people talk about resources, using up resources. There's no such thing as resources. The oil in Saudi Arabia lay there in the ground for how many thousands, how many tens of thousands, how many millions a year, until Americans discovered it and decided that they could use it for energy. Up until that time, it was no resource. Up until the 1850s, we didn't have any oil. We used whale oil. Well, the whales got extinct, and people start writing books saying the age of scarcity is upon us, so on. Now, what is true is that if we insist on inflicting scarcity upon ourselves, we can manage to succeed. I mean, if we insist on saying no nuclear energy, no coal, no this, no that, yeah, we can produce scarcity, but we'll have to work at it. We are working at it, I regret to say, with considerable success. But the Swiss are not. The Swiss have nothing. Swiss have no inflation. They have a very nice growth rate, about, what, 3-4% a year, which is a good historical average, because they are sensible about economic growth, and they are interested in economic growth. And if you have a people interested in economic growth, and the government doesn't continually, the government or some interest group rather, doesn't continually frustrate it, you will get economic growth. There are no limits to growth. Now, there may be limits, you know, if we're talking about 5,000, 20,000, 100,000 years from now, who knows? I don't know. But certainly in our lifetime, or our children's lifetime, or our grandchildren's lifetime, the idea of limits to growth, in my view, simply does not exist.
Before I call on Steve, let me ask Arthur to give some final comments.
I'm absolutely, you know, I find myself at great difficulty listening to Irving's enchantment with Switzerland. Who was it who once said, how can you think well of a society whose highest cultural achievement is the cuckoo clock? But as a matter of fact, this unlimited growth rate of Switzerland is that of the most, this growth rate of Switzerland, this quintessence of the world you like, Irving, is a world of a totally managed economy, a world of total interference within which a small island has been created by keeping out everyone. Try to get yourself a visa, a permanent license to work in Switzerland. What contribution did the Swiss make either to the rescue of Jews or to the rescue of Vietnamese? And so all of the moral values which have here been upheld as the necessities of society can indeed can only be flouted if Switzerland is to be achieved. It seems to me that you simply can't have Switzerland as the image of America, this white island which keeps everyone out it doesn't want, which lives as a kind of banking elite for the misery, while ignoring the miseries of the world. Heaven forfend that with all its problems and all its sorrows, the United States ever become like Switzerland. Because if the United States had become like Switzerland, you and I, Irving, would have been incinerated.
Right. I did not hold Switzerland up as a moral model for us to emulate. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's anything moral about economic growth. Morality arises with what you do about it, with the fruits of economic growth. Economic growth is a neutral economic process. The only point I wanted to make is that there are no inherent natural limits to growth as a result of something called the scarcity of resources. That's all.
I think there's a desire on the part of some for questions, but I think we're going to have an opportunity in a few minutes to talk informally in some other location. I want to thank our speakers for introducing this series and heading off this series with this panel this evening. And I want to turn this back at this point to Steve.
Well, I really think we solved that.
Of course. course.
Of course. We have coffee and cake, which really is the way of solving everything, Frank.
Chicken soup.
No, that's for next week. We begin with coffee and cake. It's in the room immediately behind you. So if you'd like to engage Professor Kristol or Professor Hertzberg or John Ruskay or each other, you can do that over a civilizing factor, which is eating. I'd like to just mention that our next program posits two people who have been prominent in the debate over the current policies of the State of Israel from opposing points of view, but each occupying responsible, at least important positions in institutional Jewish life against each other. Leonard Fine is the editor of Moment and has supported a position which is at odds with the current government of Israel rather vociferously. Fred Gottheil is the spokesman for the present position of the government of Israel through the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. And both will deal next week with the situation of Israel and American Jewry, the possibility that a marriage which was once a smooth one may actually be in crisis. That's next Tuesday evening, the 5th of February. We very much hope that you can be here then, and I'd like to thank our panelists, our moderator, for a very successful program.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.